She was crying on the floor of the palace at 2 in the morning, and not a single soul stopped to ask why. The guards walked past. The maids walked past. The torches on the wall flickered and kept burning like nothing was wrong. Because in the kingdom of Valdre, a princess on the floor was still a princess. And a princess did not fall apart. A princess held herself together with perfect posture and a perfect smile and never, ever made anyone uncomfortable with the truth of how she was feeling. Sera had learned that early. She had learned to cry without sound. Without sobs. Just tears, silent, controlled, falling like they had permission and nothing else. She was very good at it by now. And then a shadow fell across the corridor floor. Anne stopped. Not to help. Not to call someone. Not to look away with the polished discomfort of palace staff trained to unsee things that made them uncomfortable. It just stopped. She looked up. A guard. Dark uniform. Still as a stone wall. Looking at her, not past her, not above her, not through her, directly at her, the way no one in this palace had looked at her in years. She opened her mouth to dismiss him. She had words ready. She always had words ready. And then his hands moved. 2 fingers pressed flat against his palm, slowly, deliberately, and then opened outward, like a door swinging wide. I see you. Not, are you all right, Your Highness? Not, shall I call someone? Not the careful, practiced, palace-safe response she had been handed her whole life. I see you. And something inside Princess Sera Valdren cracked straight down the middle. That was the beginning. That 2 in the morning moment on a cold stone floor was where everything started, and where everything, eventually, would change. But to understand what that meant, you have to go back. Back 3 months, to the day a deaf palace guard named Kale arrived at the gates of Valdre and quietly, without trying, began to see every single thing the palace had trained everyone else to ignore. Stay with me. Because this story is not what you think it is. Now. Let's go back to the beginning. The palace of Valdre was beautiful in the way that very dangerous things often are. Stone walls that had stood for 400 years. Corridors so long you could lose a person in them, and sometimes, Sera thought, that was exactly the point. Gardens that bloomed in perfect, maintained rows. Candlelit banquet halls where the food was always warm and the conversations were always cold. It was the kind of place that swallowed people whole and called it tradition. Kale arrived on a Tuesday in early spring, when the frost was still climbing the palace gates in the mornings. He came with a military record, a sealed reassignment letter, and nothing else. No complaints. No requests. He signed his intake documents with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned that the world moved faster when you didn't slow it down with things it wasn't going to understand anyway. Captain Roven, a broad, red-faced man who had run the palace guard for 11 years, looked at Kale's file, then looked at Kale, then looked back at the file. You're deaf, Roven said. Kale read his lips without blinking. He signed back, and the junior guard at his shoulder, a young man named Run, assigned specifically to translate, cleared his throat. He says yes, sir. He's aware. Roven blinked. I didn't mean, I wasn't being. He also says, Run continued, with the particular careful expression of someone trying not to smile, that he's been aware for 17 years, so you don't need to worry. Roven stared at him for a long moment. Then he put the file down and showed Kale to his post. East Wing. Palace Gardens. The assignment nobody wanted because nothing ever happened there. Kale looked at the garden, the long stone path, the flowering hedges, the bench beneath the oak that was old enough to have seen kingdoms rise and fall, and felt something settle in his chest. Good. Quiet suited him. He had spent enough years in noise to have lost his taste for it. He did not know, standing there on that first morning, that a princess took her books to that garden every afternoon. That she sat on the bench under the oak tree and read with her shoes off, her feet tucked under her like a child, which was the only place in the entire palace she ever allowed herself to do something so ordinary. He did not know she would become the reason this posting would be the furthest thing from quiet. He found out on day 3. She came around the garden path at 2:30 in the afternoon, already dressed from her morning of duties, hair still pinned, posture still a masterpiece of self-discipline, and she stopped when she saw him. Just for a second. A flicker of something that wasn't quite annoyance and wasn't quite surprise. Just recalibration. Then she walked to the bench, sat down, tucked her feet underneath her, and opened her book. Cale stood at his post. He wasn't staring. He was simply doing what he always did, cataloging. Reading the room. 17 years of not hearing had made his eyes work harder than most people's, and what his eyes told him in those first minutes was interesting. Princess Sera Valdrin held her book like she was hiding behind it. Her shoulders dropped 2 inches the moment she sat down, 2 inches that had been held up all morning by something invisible and exhausting. She turned a page without reading it. Her fingers on the cover were loose where they should have been relaxed and tight where they should have been loose. This was not a woman who was fine. This was a woman performing fine with such skill that most people had probably stopped looking close enough to notice the difference. Cale noticed. He always noticed. He looked away. He came back to the garden every day. So did she. They did not speak. They did not acknowledge each other. She read her books, he stood at his post. But Cale, who had learned to read an entire room from a single glance, kept reading her, the way she pressed her lips together when something in the book made her feel something she wasn't going to let herself feel. The way she looked up sometimes, at nothing, like she was listening to a conversation happening in her own head that nobody else was invited to. She was interesting. He had not expected that. Princesses in his limited experience, which was based mostly on ceremony and protocol and the careful architecture of royalty, were not usually interesting. They were ornamental. They were trained that way. But this one had a crease between her brows that spoke of genuine thought. She had a laugh that she clearly kept on a very short leash. And she had, he noticed one afternoon, been looking at his hands. Not rudely. Not the way people usually looked at signing, with that particular cocktail of fascination and pity that had always made him want to fold his hands out of sight. She was looking with recognition. With something that looked almost like memory. He filed that away. He didn't know what to do with it yet. What Cale did not see, because he was at his post and the palace was a world of separate compartments, was what happened to Sera every hour before she arrived in the garden. He didn't see the morning briefings where her suggestions were heard and then redirected, politely, toward the conclusions her father had already reached. He didn't see the dress fittings where the seamstress spoke to the Queen Mother about Sera's measurements as if Sera were not standing directly inside them. He didn't see the afternoon receptions where she smiled and poured tea and answered questions about her anticipated wedding date with a composure so practiced it looked like contentment. He didn't see Lord Davin. Davin arrived at the palace on the 12th day of Cale's posting, a courtesy visit, the court called it, though everyone understood what courtesy visits from the Davin estate meant. He was tall, polished, handsome in the particular way of men whose handsomeness had always worked in their favor. He wore it like a tool. He was charming at the right moments, deferential at the right moments, and he held Sera's hand in the receiving hall with the easy confidence of a man who had already, in his own head, finished the acquisition. Sera smiled. She let him hold her hand. She said the right things. She came to the garden that afternoon and didn't open her book at all. She just sat, staring at the oak tree, doing something with her left hand, small, subtle movements, like she was talking to herself in a language she kept very quiet. Cale watched her fingers. He recognized what she was doing. The shapes were unpracticed, slightly wrong, the grammar of someone who had learned young and not touched it since. But they were signs. Real signs. He watched her left hand form them against her thigh like a secret. Something about it hit him somewhere he wasn't expecting. He looked away before she could catch him looking. On the 14th day, she spoke to him. Not to him, about him. She had arrived to find him already there, and he had glanced at her the way he always did, that brief cataloging assessment that he genuinely didn't know read as staring. She had looked up from her bag, looked at him, looked at Ren, and said, "Would you please tell the guard to stop staring at me?" Ren had translated. Cale had received it, processed it, and signed back. Ren said, "He apologizes, Your Highness." Sera nodded and opened her book. But she had seen more than Ren translated. Because Cale's hands had done something before the apology, a single sign, quick, that Ren had smoothed over without mentioning. And Sera, who had learned sign from a palace servant's daughter when she was 14 and never told a living soul, had caught it. The sign had been, noted. Not sorry. Not my apologies, Your Highness. Noted. She turned a page. She did not smile. But the corner of her mouth did something very small that she immediately controlled. The next afternoon, she came back. Ron was not there. It was just Cale at his post, and Sera at her bench, and the oak tree standing between them like a patient witness. She opened her book. She stared at the same page for 4 minutes. Then, very casually, not looking up, she signed, awkward, her fingers stumbling over the shapes like she was trying to remember which drawer she'd put them in. Do you always stare? Cale went absolutely still. The garden seemed to hold its breath. He signed back, slowly, making sure she could follow every word. Only at things that are real. The book closed. She looked up. Their eyes met across the garden path, and neither of them looked away. This was the problem with silence. Most people filled it with noise because they couldn't stand what lived inside it. Cale had never had that option. He had learned early that silence was not empty. It was full of what people meant and couldn't say, full of things that mattered too much for words, full of the truth that sound was always covering up. And in that first real moment between them, the silence said, I know you're not okay. And I'm not going to pretend I don't. Sera looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened her book again. But she didn't leave early. She stayed until the light went golden and the garden went cool. And when she stood to go, she signed one word, small, like she wasn't sure she meant to do it, and it was simply, tomorrow. Cale watched her walk back toward the palace. He stayed at his post for another hour, looking at the space where she had been, thinking about a princess who had hidden a whole language inside herself for 10 years and had pulled it out, in a garden, for him, for no reason she could probably name, because some part of her had needed to be understood more than it needed to be safe. He pressed his fist once, slow, to his chest. Tomorrow came. And the day after that. They built it slowly, the way careful things are built, by people who understand that rushing something real is how you break it before it becomes what it was supposed to be. She came to the garden. He was at his post. They talked in sign, her vocabulary growing daily, his patience with her imperfect grammar absolute and wordless. She asked him once, her hands clumsy around the question, does it bother you? When people get it wrong? He thought about it seriously. Then, only when they stopped trying. She looked at her own hands. Then back at him. She signed, I haven't touched this in 10 years. He signed, I know. You hold the shapes like they're borrowed. She blinked. Then, and this was the first time he saw it fully, unguarded, real, she laughed. Not a palace laugh. A real one, short and surprised, the kind that escapes before you can decide whether to let it. She looked immediately around the garden, checking whether anyone had seen. Cale watched her do it and felt something tighten in his chest that he chose, very deliberately, not to examine. They talked about books she was reading, he had opinions, and his opinions were sharper than she expected, and they disagreed about 2 of them with the productive ferocity of people who had actually thought about the thing they were arguing about. She told him about a philosophy text she'd stolen from her brother's shelf and he signed back, is it stealing if it was going to waste? She said, that's exactly what I told myself. He said, smart. She said, quieter, no one here usually says that. He signed, I know. I've been watching. She went very still. Not defensively. Just absorbing it. The fact of being seen. The strange weight of it when you had gone so long unseen that you had almost convinced yourself it was normal. You've been watching, she said it out loud, then caught herself and signed it. He read her lips and her hands simultaneously. He signed, since I arrived. You perform everything. All day. Every room. Then you come here and you take your shoes off. This is the only honest part of your day. The air went out of the garden. She stared at him. He held her gaze without apology. She should have been offended. She had dismissed guards for less. She was a princess of Valdre and he was, she started to think it and stopped herself, because the word that rose up was not guard. The word that rose up was the truest thing anyone had said to her in years, carved into the air between them in sign language where no one else could read it. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She walked away. She came back the next afternoon. She didn't say anything about the day before. She sat down, tucked her feet under her, and opened her book. After a minute, she signed without looking up, "Teach me something new today." He taught her the sign for stubborn. She signed it back perfectly and pointed at him. He pointed at her. They were both right. The Queen Mother's aide was a woman named Petra, small, efficient, with the memory of a palace archivist and the instincts of someone who had spent 20 years understanding that her job was not to manage events but to manage information about events. Petra noticed things. It was her particular gift and her primary function. She noticed Princess Sera visiting the East Garden with increasing regularity. She noticed that the princess no longer brought a second book to read on the way there, the way she used to. She noticed that the princess returned from the garden with color in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the weather, and that she had, on 2 separate occasions, smiled at something on her way back through the East Corridor, private, unperformed. The smile of someone thinking about a thing they weren't going to tell anyone. Petra brought this information to the Queen Mother on a Wednesday afternoon, folded inside a conversation about the upcoming state dinner, placed between 2 harmless pieces of news so that it did not look alarming. Petra was very good at her job. Queen Mother Lyra heard it all without changing her expression. She was sitting at her dressing table while her maid arranged her hair, and she held very still while this information settled into place, a skill she had developed over 30 years of receiving news she did not like. "Which guard?" she said. "The new one. East Wing. The one with the D." Petra made a brief gesture with her hands. "The deaf one," Lyra said. "Yes, Your Majesty." Silence. The maid continued with her hair. Lyra looked at her own reflection in the mirror, at the face she had spent 30 years keeping unreadable, and said nothing else. "Should I?" "No," said the Queen Mother. "I'll speak to Sera myself." She called Sera in that evening. The Queen Mother's sitting room was warm and lit with candles and smelled of the rose oil that Lyra had burned for as long as Sera could remember. It was a room designed to feel safe. Sera had long ago understood that rooms designed to feel safe were often the most dangerous ones. "Sit with me," her mother said, already pouring tea. Sera sat. She accepted her cup. She folded her hands in her lap with the perfect stillness of a woman who had been preparing for this conversation since the moment Petra glanced at her in the corridor this afternoon and looked away too quickly. "I hear you've been spending time in the East Garden," Lyra said. "I read there most afternoons," Sera said. "I have for years." "Yes." Her mother smiled. The smile of someone about to say something underneath something else. "It's a lovely habit. The air is good for you." A pause, precisely timed. "You mustn't make pets of the staff, my love." There it was. Sera did not move. Not a single muscle. She had trained herself for this, for the moments when something real was being dismissed with something polite, and the only permitted response was to accept the dismissal gracefully. To thank the language for being gentle while it cut. "Of course," Sera said. Her mother reached over and patted her hand. "Good girl." She sipped her tea. "The Davin family is coming for a longer visit next week. It would be lovely to have you present for the dinners this time." "Of course," Sera said again. She stayed for another 20 minutes. She was charming. She was composed. She asked the right questions about the dinner arrangements and laughed at the right moment when her mother said something dry about the court seamstress. She walked back to her rooms through the East Corridor. And there, on a shelf, in a vase that Davin had sent when the engagement discussions first began, a round cream-colored thing she had never once liked, she picked it up. And she set it down on the stone floor. Hard. The crash echoed through the corridor. A maid appeared at the far end, alarmed. Sera looked at the pieces on the floor and felt something in her chest unlock, briefly, like a window thrown open in a room that had been sealed too long. "An accident," she said. "Have someone clean it up." She went to her room and sat on her bed in the dark for a long time. Cale noticed she didn't come the next day. He stood at his post in the East Garden and watched the path and she did not appear. The bench under the oak sat empty. The afternoon moved through its light at its usual pace, indifferent. He stood there until his shift ended. He signed to no one, looking at the empty bench. "Where did you go?" Then he walked back to the guard quarters, sat on his bunk, and did the thing he did when something was bothering him, which was to think about it with absolute clarity and then set it aside. He was good at setting things aside. He had needed to be. His life had required it. But she didn't come the day after that either. Or the day after. On the fourth day, Run sat across from him at the long table in the guards' mess hall and watched Kale eat in silence and finally signed, clumsy but earnest, "She's not coming, is she?" Kale signed, "She'll come." Run signed, "How do you know?" Kale looked at him. Then, "Because she has nowhere else to take her shoes off." Run looked at him for a long moment and then went back to his food with the expression of a man who had understood something he wished he hadn't. She came back on the fifth day. No explanation. No mention of the gap. She came around the garden path at her usual time, sat at the bench, tucked her feet under her. Kale stood at his post. The silence between them was different. It had something in it now, a weight that hadn't been there before. The particular gravity of things that have been acknowledged without being said. After a long moment, she signed, "I'm not supposed to be here." He signed, "Either am I." She looked up. He held her gaze. He signed, "But here we are." Something shifted in her face, so small that anyone else would have missed it. A softening. Like a room where someone had finally opened a curtain that had been drawn for a very long time. She opened her book. But she signed, without looking up, "I was told to stop coming." He signed, "I know." She did look up then. Surprised. He signed, "Petra noticed." She always notices. She has been reporting to your mother for 20 years. Sera stared at him. "How do you?" He touched 2 fingers to his eyes, then gestured to the wider world. "Watching." He was always watching. "Right," Sera said quietly. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she signed, "Does it ever get exhausting? Seeing everything?" Kale considered this honestly, which was the only way he knew how to consider anything. He signed, "Does it get exhausting, performing everything?" She laughed, that same short, startled sound, the real one, and then pressed her fingers to her mouth to catch it. He watched her do it. He watched her suppress the laugh, the way she always suppressed everything, automatically, reflexively, like breathing. He signed, "Stop doing that." She lowered her hand. She looked at him. He looked back. Nobody spoke. Nobody signed. The garden held them both in its late afternoon light and was, for once, exactly what it looked like, quiet and real and honest. Lord Davin arrived for his extended visit on a Monday. Kale was posted at the palace's main entrance for the reception, a rotation, nothing unusual. He stood with the other guards along the entrance hall while the court assembled in their formal arrangement and the Davin retinue came through the great doors. Davin himself walked in like a man who owned the room. Not aggressively. Confidently. The confidence of someone who had never walked into a room where his presence was unwelcome. Sera was standing to her father's left, in green, her hair pinned with the gold combs she wore for formal occasions. She smiled when Davin crossed to her. She let him take her hand. She said something that made him laugh. She was very good at making men laugh, Kale had noticed. She was good at giving people the version of herself they wanted. Kale stood at the entrance and watched the room. He watched Davin, specifically, because 17 years of reading people through silence had given him the skill of watching what people said when they thought they weren't being watched. Davin, standing beside Sera and holding her hand and smiling for the room, Davin turned to the Lord standing at his shoulder and said something under the cover of the room's noise. Kale read his lips from across the hall. He stood completely still. He read them again to make sure. To make absolutely sure. Then he spent the rest of his shift standing very correctly at his post with his jaw tight and his hands clasped behind his back and something burning in his chest that had no good name. That night, in the guard quarters, he sat with a piece of paper and a pen, the things he used when the world required him to communicate on its terms, not his, and he wrote down what he had read on Davin's lips. He looked at the words. He folded the paper. He put it in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket. He sat with it for a long time. He did not know what he was going to do with it. He did not know if he had the right to do anything with it. He was a palace guard. She was a princess. The geometry of this was not complicated. But the thing Davin had said sat in his chest like a splinter, working its way in, and Kale, who had spent his whole life watching people be reduced and dismissed and filed into shapes that didn't fit them, found that he could not make peace with it. He pressed a fist to his chest, slow. He put the paper away. The next afternoon, she came to the garden. She was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that had a specific shape to it, like something heavy was sitting on her chest and she was breathing carefully around it. She sat. She opened her book. She stared at the same page for 6 minutes. Then she looked up and signed, "Teach me something." He thought about it. Then he moved his hands into a shape, deliberate, clear. She watched his fingers. She didn't recognize it. She signed, "What is that?" He signed, "Courage." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why that one?" He looked at her steadily. She held his gaze. He signed, "Because it's what you keep almost having." The words landed. He watched them land. He watched something move through her face, not offense, not argument, something that looked like the feeling you get when someone says a true thing out loud that you have been carrying in the dark by yourself for a very long time. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she formed the sign, carefully, correctly. Courage. She held it. Then she put her hands in her lap and looked at the oak tree and didn't speak for the rest of the afternoon. Neither did he. It was one of the most honest conversations either of them had ever had. She found out about the engagement the morning of the announcement. Not the day before. Not in a private conversation where her father looked at her and spoke to her like a daughter. Not with any of the consideration that would have made it easier to swallow. She found out over breakfast. Sera set her cup down. She looked at her mother. Her mother was already looking at something on the table, a letter, a menu card, something, and did not look up. "Tonight," Sera said. "Yes." Her mother smiled. "The dress has already been selected. Petra laid it out this morning." Sera thought of a number of things she could say. She thought of them with the clarity of a person who had been practicing silence for so long that her thoughts had become very, very loud. She thought of everything she might say and she sorted through it quickly and she found, at the bottom of all of it, the same answer she always found, that none of it would matter. "Of course," she said. She picked up her cup. She drank her tea. The state dinner was everything a state dinner in Valdray always was, beautiful and interminable and full of people performing versions of themselves that had been approved by someone else. Sera sat at the high table in her selected dress, deep blue, which was a good color on her, which she suspected was a calculated choice, to make her look like someone who had chosen this, and she smiled and nodded and lifted her glass when her father rose to make the announcement. The room applauded. Davin took her hand. He was warm and bright-eyed and the picture of a pleased man, and the court looked at them and saw what they were meant to see, a good match, a strategic alliance, a future that served Valdray well. Sera smiled. She did not look toward the north entrance where the guards were posted. She did not look for a dark uniform and still eyes and hands that said things in silence that no one else in this room would ever understand. She kept her gaze on the table and her hands in her lap, and she did not let them shake until she was back in her room and the door was shut and the night was finally over. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and she shook. She found him at dawn. The east corridor was empty at that hour, the torches still burning from the night before, the palace not yet awake. Kale was finishing a night shift rotation, moving through the corridor on his way back to the guard quarters, and he turned the corner and she was there. She was still in her dinner dress. She had not slept. Her hair was half undone, the gold combs pulled out but not all of them, and she looked, he took this in 1 second, the way he took everything in, like someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had finally, privately, put it down. They stood in the corridor and looked at each other. She signed, her hands controlled, precise, the hands of someone who was not going to allow themselves to be imprecise about this, did you know? 2 days. The corridor went very still. Then why, she stopped. Started again. Her hands were not as controlled now. Then why didn't you? He reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket. He produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out. She looked at it. She looked at him. The corridor was absolutely silent. He had said, she's manageable. The quiet kind. The kind that's grateful. That was it. No dramatic cruelty. No named violence. Just manageable. The quiet kind. The kind that's grateful. The casual, wine-warm confidence of a man who had looked at a princess of Valdre, brilliant, multilingual, privately fierce, carrying a hidden language in her hands, and had summarized her in 3 words that told you exactly how much he had ever intended to see her. Manageable. Sera stood in the corridor with that piece of paper in her hands and felt something she hadn't felt in years, not sadness. Not the familiar resigned grief of being overlooked. Something hotter than that. Something that had been sitting under the surface of all that composure for a very long time. She looked up. Cale was watching her. Not with pity. Not with the careful, measured concern of someone managing a delicate situation. With something that looked like recognition, the deep, specific kind that comes from one person seeing themselves in another's experience. She signed, and her hands were not careful now. How do you stand it? People deciding what you are before you've even spoken? He signed. I stopped letting their voices be the loudest ones in the room. She stared at him. She signed, but you can't hear them. And there it was. The thing he had never said directly but had been living in the space between everything since the first day, that the silence was not the deprivation the world assumed it was. That the world's voices, its judgments, its definitions, its manageable and quiet and grateful, had simply never been given the power to reach him. That he had lived, by necessity, in the only place where those voices could not go. And he had found it, that place, to be far more honest than the noise. The next afternoon in the garden, something was different. She was restless, not the contained restlessness she usually brought with her and managed carefully, but something rawer. She kept looking up from her book. She kept signing things half-finished and then stopping. He stood at his post and watched her and understood, because he had felt this himself, the particular agitation of someone who has started to understand something they can't understand, and hasn't yet figured out where to put it. He signed, what? She gestured broadly, at the palace, at the garden, at the whole particular architecture of their situation. He considered it. Then, yes. She looked almost relieved that he'd said it. She signed, you never look angry. He signed, I've had a long time to learn where to put it. She, where? He touched his sternum. In here. Where it belongs to me and no one else. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, and she signed it at the same time, which she only did when something mattered enough to use both, I have spent my entire life making sure my anger belonged to other people. Making it something I gave away. An apology. An adjustment. A smile. He signed, I know. She, it's exhausting. He, I know. Not badly. Not unreasonably. But it came out sharp, the way things do when they've been held in too long. Stop saying I know. Out loud. Loud enough that it surprised her. Stop looking at me like you already understand everything and you're just waiting for me to catch up. You don't know. You've been watching for 2 months and you think you know but you don't know what it's like to. She stopped. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. He signed, don't. She looked up. He signed, you don't have to manage this. Not here. She stared at him. Her jaw was working. She looked away, at the oak tree, at the path, at anything except the person who was holding absolutely still and offering her, without condition, the exact thing she had not known she needed, the permission to be imperfect. She stood up. She grabbed her bag. She walked away down the garden path. Cale watched her go. Then, slowly, he pressed a closed fist to his chest. He held it there. The sign for heartache. For regret. For something he was not, quite yet, ready to name. Cale signed, no. Ren, Cale. Cale, I heard you. Run, you didn't hear anything, you read my hands. Cale, don't be clever. What do you want to say? Ren sat with his hands for a moment, organizing what he meant. Then, I've seen enough. Between the two of you in that garden. And I need you to understand, this doesn't end well. This doesn't end well for you specifically. You've already been reassigned once for going against what powerful men wanted. You know what happens if. Cale signed, flat, I know. Run, then stop. Run opened his mouth. Closed it. He had not stopped. When it had mattered and the cost was real, Ren had not stopped either, once. And they both knew it. Kale signed, not unkindly, "I'm not being careless. I know what this is and I know what it isn't. I'm not asking for anything." "Ron, you don't have to ask. That's the problem." Kale had no answer for that. Because Ren was right, and they both knew it, and knowing it changed nothing at all. The night of the state ball arrived. The great hall of Valdre was lit with 1,000 candles and full of silken sound and the warm weight of celebration. Lord Davin led Sera across the floor and they danced, and they were Kale could see it from the north entrance, could see it clearly, beautiful together. The picture of a future. Davin was a good dancer. He held her correctly. He said something that made her smile. Kale stood at his post and kept his face exactly the way it always was, still. Present. Giving away nothing that he wasn't willing to give. She held them for 1 second. Then her hand, against the side of her ball gown where no one could see, moved. A small motion. 3 shapes. Her own adaptation, slightly wrong, entirely unmistakable. His name. She was signing his name. Kale closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Just one. The ball ended near midnight. She went down the west corridor. Then she stopped, stood in the dim and quiet, and made a decision. Kale was off rotation. His shift had ended an hour ago. He was supposed to be in the guard quarters. He was in the east corridor. He had not planned it. He had walked the long way back. He had not been able to tell himself, clearly and honestly, why. They stood looking at each other. He was in his off-duty jacket. She was still in her ball gown, the gold comb still in her hair, but she had her shoes in one hand and she was standing on the cold stone floor in bare feet and she looked, for the first time, in all the weeks he had been watching, like she had entirely given up on performing. She signed, slowly, "I'm not going to pretend I walked this way by accident." The space between them was 6 feet. It was nothing. It was everything. He signed, and his hands were very careful. "I need you to understand what this would cost. I need you to actually understand it, not the version of it that feels possible from here." She signed, "I have spent my entire life surrounded by things that cost nothing. Everything is safe and approved and appropriate and it costs nothing. And I have nothing. I have a schedule and a dress and a man who calls me manageable and I have nothing that is mine except a hidden language and a bench in a garden." Anne. She stopped. "And you," she did not sign. She did not sign it and he read it anyway, in the space where her hands stopped moving, in the thing her face did when she caught herself. He was close enough now. He had moved without deciding to, or he had decided without knowing he was deciding, and they were standing 4 feet apart now, 3, and she had not stepped back, and the corridor was very quiet. He signed, barely, "Sera." She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. The almost was its own complete thing, a whole world that existed in the space of held breath and held back motion, full of everything that was true and couldn't yet be said out loud. He wanted to. She could see that he wanted to and the wanting of it, the fact that someone looked at her like this, like she was worth the cost, like she was worth anything, broke something small and important open in her chest. And then he stepped back. 1 step. Deliberate. She stared at him. She said out loud, barely above a whisper, "What if I don't let them?" He looked at her for a long moment. A long, full, undisguised moment. Then he signed, "Then I'll be here." She held those 3 words in the air between them. She put her shoes back on. She walked away. And for the first time in her memory, walking away from something felt nothing like retreat. She did not have anyone followed. She did not make accusations. She was, as she had always been, more elegant than that. Lyra sat with her afternoon tea and felt, not satisfaction. Something more complicated than that. The particular sadness of a woman who had made this decision before, from the other side, and still believed it was right. She called Sera in that evening. "I wanted you to hear it from me," she said, over tea, in the candlelit sitting room that smelled of roses. "There's been a reassignment. The guard in the East Wing, a promotion, really, to the Northern Garrison. Effective in 10 days. Sera held her teacup. She left her tea unfinished. She went back to her rooms. And for the first time in years, maybe the first time in her adult life, Princess Sera Valdrin cried with sound. Not the practiced silence. Not the performed composure. Real, ugly, disorganized grief that filled her room and had nowhere to go and didn't care whether anyone was comfortable with it. She cried like someone who had just understood exactly what she was losing and exactly what it said about the life she had been living that it could be taken so easily. She did not recognize the sound she was making. She had never heard herself before. He read it once. He folded it. He sat with it on his bunk and was not surprised, because he had been expecting some version of this from the moment he understood what was happening in the East Garden, and you did not get to be the person Kale had become, decorated, reassigned, surviving, without making a clear-eyed accounting of how the world arranged its consequences. He was not surprised. He was not, exactly, resigned. He got up. He found paper and a pen. He wrote 2 pages. He sealed them. He found Rin in the morning and Ron looked at it. Looked at him. Kale signed, only if she asks. Ron took it. He signed, she'll ask. Kale met his eyes. He signed, I know. Thank you. He walked away before either of them could make it awkward. She signed, I heard. He signed, I know. He, yes. She looked at him. Her hands were at her sides. She said, out loud, Rin has something for me, doesn't he? Not a question. He nodded. She took the east corridor to the garden. She sat on the bench under the oak tree. She took off her shoes. I have watched you for months. You are not manageable. I want to be precise about this, you are the least manageable person I have ever encountered, in the best possible sense. You have been managed, trained, shaped, arranged, and you have cooperated with such skill that almost no one can see the difference between cooperation and agreement. But I can see the difference. I have been watching the difference since the day you sat in this garden and signed to yourself when you thought no one could understand you. You are not quiet. You are fluent in a language that the people around you have never bothered to learn. That is not the same thing. Do not disappear, Sera. Whatever else happens. Do not let them make you disappear. She read it twice. Then she folded it and pressed it flat against her chest and sat under the oak tree in the garden with the evening coming in cold around her, and she felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. Something that was grief and gratitude and fury and clarity, all at once, all mixed together into something that was none of those things individually and all of them together. She had been named. Not her title. Not her function. Not her usefulness or her manageability or her value in the geometry of alliances. Then she stood up. She put her shoes on. She smoothed her dress. She walked into the palace and she went, without stopping, directly to her father's study. She did not go to her mother. She went to her father. Her father had not decided. Or rather, he had not been asked to. She stood in front of his desk. She did not have notes. She had not prepared this speech. She had walked here directly from the garden with a letter pressed to her chest and the word manageable sitting in her teeth, and she had decided that if she thought about it any more she would find reasons to stop. I want to speak to you, she said. Not as a princess. As your daughter. He blinked. He set down his pen. He said, sit down, Sera. Yes. Lyra folded her hands on the table. She was very still. Sera. You taught me to be silent, Sera said. Her voice was even. You taught me that silence was safe. You taught me that performance was survival. You spent 20 years teaching me to disappear into the shape of what was expected. She paused. You thought you were protecting me. Her mother's face did not move. She had done this. She had loved her daughter and done this. Sera stood up. She smoothed her dress. She walked to the door. I know you believe it was love, she said. I know it was love. That's the part that's hard to carry. She looked at her mother one more time. I'm going to need you to love me differently now. I hope you can. She left the door open behind her. Kale's last shift at the main palace was on a Friday. He did not go to the East Garden. He had decided this clearly, in the night, and he held to it. He was not going to give himself the version of this that would make it harder. He was not going to stand under the oak tree and sign last things to the empty bench because she would not be there and the bench would just be a bench, and he was not a man who performed grief for an audience of one. He walked toward the guard quarters to begin packing his things. She was there. He stopped. The corridor was quiet. The torch on the wall burned. He looked at her, and this was one of the last times he would look at her from this close, from this place, in this particular light, and he was aware of it, and he looked at her anyway, fully, without reservation, the way he had learned to look at things he valued, like they deserved to be seen. He took her hand. In full view of the corridor. In full view of anyone who might be watching from either end. He held her hand in his, and the palace could see it, and he was finished pretending he cared more about what the palace saw than about this moment. He signed, "You already have it. You've had it the whole time." She looked at her own hand. She closed her fingers around the shape like she was keeping it. He walked past her. He walked down the corridor toward the guard quarters. He did not look back. He did not trust himself to. She stood in the corridor for a long time after he was gone. She thought about 10 days of silence ahead, about the northern garrison 3 hours away, about Davin and the engagement announcement and the king's study and her mother's unreadable face cracking open for one single, real moment. She thought about a letter that said you were never manageable, you were never quiet, you were never any of the things they said. Then she picked up a pen. And she drew. Badly, she had never been a skilled artist, and her hands made the shapes clumsily, earnestly, with the particular effort of someone who is trying to say something precisely and doesn't have a better tool for it. "I see you." She sealed the envelope. No name on the front. She found Ren in the morning. She held it out. He didn't need to. Kale arrived in the early afternoon, unpacked almost nothing, a habit of a man who had lived in provisional places long enough to not get attached to arrangements, and sat by the stone window in his new quarters and watched the landscape outside, which was rockier than the palace gardens and wider and lit with the flat, clean light of the north. He was not hopeful. He was careful about hope in the same way he was careful about most things, not avoiding it, just handling it with the clear eyes of someone who understood that hoping without acting was just waiting. And he had done all the acting available to him. The rest was not in his hands. On the second day, a junior officer knocked on his door. He held out a sealed envelope. Palace wax. No name on the exterior. Kale took it. He opened it. Then he pressed the drawing flat between his palms, and he held it, and outside the stone window the northern light moved through its wide flat arc and the world went on being exactly what it was. But she was different. She was standing in the same palace she had been born in, standing at the same window she had stood at 1,000 times, and she was, for the first time, tonight, right now, standing in it differently. That was something. That was not nothing. She signed the things she meant. She signed them clearly, correctly, all the vocabulary she had built over months of afternoons in a garden where she had slowly, dangerously, irrevocably become herself. She was not performing. She was not silent. She was not afraid. And whatever came next, the engagement, the court, the long and complicated machinery of a kingdom that had decided who she was before she could, she was going to meet it as herself. Not quiet. Not grateful.